Motion in your step.
Motivation in your heart.
Hello, and welcome to today's Motion and Motivation podcast.
We've put together a study guide for everyone. If you need it, you can grab it from the video description.
Okay, so we're diving into the early days of SpaceX today. You know, the period from 2000 to 2010 when it was still finding its footing. We're talking about those crucial years before the Falcon 9, before they were launching astronauts for NASA. This is really about how this ambitious, some might even say crazy, startup challenged the giants of the aerospace industry and, kind of rewrote the rules of space travel along the way. And for this deep dive, we're going back to Eric Berger's book, Liftoff. It's a really insightful look at those early years, full of, those kind of make-or-break moments that could easily sunk SpaceX before it even got off the ground.
Yeah, what's amazing to me is how different SpaceX operated from day one compared to, the Boeings and Lockheed Martins of the world.
Right. Talk about David versus Goliath, but with rockets, right?
Exactly. And Berger does a great job, kind of pulling back the curtain on Elon Musk's vision for the company.
Because it wasn't just about building rockets, was it? It was about completely changing how we get to space.
Exactly. Musk's whole strategy was based on a few key principles. First, a small, really agile team. No layers of bureaucracy. Second, super rapid development cycles. And finally, an almost obsessive focus on cost efficiency. This meant really embracing what they called iterative design.
Which basically means?
Basically, build it, test it, break it, learn from it, and improve it fast. Not getting, bogged down in years of planning and risk aversion like traditional aerospace companies often do,
Yeah, it's kind of like the Silicon Valley approach applied to rocket science.
Exactly. Move fast and break things, right?
Right. Although, hopefully not too many things when you're talking about rockets. But seriously, imagine trying to convince seasoned engineers to, take a risk on a startup with such a radical approach.
Some might even say reckless.
Well, maybe.
Yeah.
But Musk has this, uncanny ability to get people to buy into his vision.
Oh, absolutely. And Berger has some great stories about this in the book. There's this one about Bielan Alton.
Alton, the avionics genius.
Exactly. So Musk calls him up, right? Lays out his whole grand plan for SpaceX, colonizing Mars, the whole 9 yards. And Alton's thinking, yeah, this sounds interesting, but I've got a good thing going. I'm not really looking for a change. Then Musk drops the bomb. He says, oh, by the way, I spoke with Larry Page, the Google guy.
No way.
Oh, yeah. And Page had agreed to give Alton a sweet remote work deal if he joins SpaceX.
So he could work on rockets and Google at the same time.
Well, not exactly, but it was enough to pique Alton's interest.
I bet. Talk about a power move. That's one heck of a recruiting tactic.
Yeah.
That really shows the lengths Musk would go to secure the best talent. And that dedication didn't stop there, did it? I mean, Berger really paints a vivid picture of those early days at SpaceX.
It was intense, lots of long hours, fueled by passion, a healthy dose of idealism, and according to Berger, lots of cheap beer.
Sounds like my kind of place.
Okay.
But in all seriousness, these are people working towards a common goal, a goal that seemed almost impossible at the time.
Absolutely. But before they could even think about launching rockets, they needed a place to, actually launch them from.
Which seems pretty obvious when you say it like that.
Right. So they initially looked at Mojave, California, which makes sense, right?
Seems like a logical choice. Lots of open space.
It was, but they ran into some, let's say, bureaucratic hurdles with the Air Force.
Bureaucracy, the enemy of progress, right?
Tell me about it. And delays were just not part of Musk's plan. He wanted to move fast, remember?
Right, the iterative design thing.
Exactly. So they needed a location that was, a little more, shall we say, free from red tape, even if it meant going off the beaten path.
And that's how they ended up on Kwajalein Atoll, a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Talk about a change of scenery.
Yeah, Kwajalein was definitely off the grid. But it offered something that SpaceX desperately needed at that point, autonomy.
So they could basically do what they wanted when they wanted without anyone looking over their shoulder.
Pretty much.
Wow.
It was the ultimate proving ground.
So they've got this island, but I imagine setting up shop there couldn't have been easy. Did Berger go into any detail about the logistics of, building a launch site on a remote island in the Pacific?
Oh, he definitely did. It's a fascinating part of the story. I mean, they had to build everything from scratch, the launch pad, the hangar, even just figuring out how to communicate with the rocket during launch. Because get this, no one could actually remain on the island during a test.
Seriously, why not?
Safety regulations. This tiny island was, and still is, used for ballistic missile testing.
Oh, wow. Okay, that makes sense, I guess.
Yeah, so they had to get creative with their telemetry and tracking systems.
Talk about a crash course in well, everything. So they've got their island, they've got their engine, they've got their out-sweat, out-drink, out-launch T-shirts, and that's another fun detail from the book, and they're ready for their first launch attempt.
It was a moment filled with both excitement and anxiety, you know? I mean, here you have this small team with no experience launching rockets, and they're about to attempt something that's never been done before, launching a privately developed, liquid-fueled rocket into orbit.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Totally. But their first attempt, it didn't quite go as planned.
What happened?
Technical glitches forced them to scrub the launch at the last minute.
Oh, I bet that was a major letdown for the team.
It was a setback for sure, but, they took it in stride. Remember that whole iterative design thing?
Right, right.
They were already operating on the principle that failures were just opportunities to learn and improve. And they would need that resilience.
Because their journey to orbit, it was far from over.
Their second launch attempt, it was so close, yet so far,
So close, but no cigar.
Exactly. The Falcon 1, it soared through the first stage, no problem. But just 5 minutes into the flight, disaster struck.
What went wrong this time?
The second stage engine. It shut down prematurely. Yeah, they traced the issue back to fuel sloshing inside that second stage tank.
Fuel sloshing.
Yeah, basically the fuel was moving around too much inside the tank during flight, and it messed with the engine's ability to, actually get the fuel it needed.
Okay, so how do you prevent that?
Well, you can add baffles or compartments inside the tank to limit the fuel movement,
Makes sense.
but those add weight, and SpaceX, they were obsessed with minimizing weight. Remember, every extra kilogram means you need more fuel to get to orbit, which drives up costs.
Right, of course.
So they knew about the fuel sloshing risk, but they accepted it as a trade-off.
A calculated gamble.
Exactly, and it's a perfect example of how SpaceX operated differently.
How so?
They were willing to take risks to push the limits of what was considered possible in rocketry, even if it meant things might not always go perfectly. And that's something that traditional aerospace companies, they just weren't used to doing.
Right, because failure for them, it wasn't just a setback. It could be a PR nightmare.
Exactly. It could mean losing government contracts, facing congressional inquiries, the whole 9 yards.
So 2 launches, 2 failures.
Yeah, the pressure was definitely mounting at that point.
I bet. Both internally and externally, right? I
Yeah.
mean, people had to be starting to doubt whether SpaceX could actually pull this off.
Oh, absolutely. Berger talks about how even some people inside SpaceX were starting to have second thoughts.
Really?
Yeah, it's understandable, right? I mean, when you keep pouring your heart and soul into something and it just keeps blowing up, it's hard not to start questioning things.
Yeah, for sure. But the true test of a team is how they respond to those setbacks.
Absolutely. And to their credit, the SpaceX team, they didn't crumble under pressure.
They kept going.
They doubled down, they analyzed the data, they identified the problems, and they worked tirelessly to fix them.
Because they knew what was at stake.
Exactly. This wasn't just about proving the doubters wrong. It was about survival.
Because they were running out of money, right?
They were on the verge of bankruptcy. One more failure, and that would have been it. Game over.
Wow, talk about high stakes. So they knew they had to make their third launch count.
They did, but unfortunately it wasn't meant to be.
Another failure.
Yeah, this one was particularly hard to swallow.
What happened?
This time, the first and second stages of the rocket, they collided just minutes after liftoff.
Collided? How does that even happen?
It turned out to be a really strange and unexpected issue. Basically, there was some residual thrust from the first stage engine even after it had shut down.
Oh.
And that little bit of extra thrust, it was enough to cause the first stage to bump into the second stage just as they were separating.
Wow, I guess they don't teach you that in rocket science school.
They don't.
So 3 launches, 3 failures.
3 very public, very expensive failures.
It's incredible that they didn't just throw in the towel at that point.
They were so close to doing just that.
What kept them going?
Well, a combination of things, I think. First, there was this unwavering belief in their mission, this idea that what they were doing was bigger than just one company.
They were trying to revolutionize space travel, right?
Exactly. And they knew that if they gave up, it would set the whole dream of private spaceflight back years.
Right, because if they couldn't do it, who could?
Exactly. But it wasn't just about idealism. There was also a healthy dose of stubbornness.
You mean they were just too stubborn to quit?
Maybe a little bit. But it was more than that. They had poured everything into this company, their time, their energy, their own money in some cases. They weren't going to let it all go down the drain without one last fight.
So what did that last fight look like? Because at this point, they were out of money, right? SpaceX was on the verge of bankruptcy.
They were, and they knew they couldn't afford another failure. Their fourth launch attempt, it had to be a success.
No pressure.
But before they could even think about launching again, they needed a payload.
Something to put on top of that rocket.
Exactly. And with no commercial customers lining up quite yet, they had to get creative.
This is where the RatSat comes in, right?
Ah, yes, RatSat, the stuff of legends.
It's such a great story.
It really is. This dummy satellite, basically just a hunk of metal with some sensors on it, it became a symbol of SpaceX's resourcefulness and determination.
So they cobbled together this satellite from spare parts. They've got their rocket barely held together after the last few attempts, and they need to get all of this to Kwajalein for the launch.
Which, as you can imagine, is not exactly easy or cheap.
Because you can't just, ship a rocket like a regular package, right?
Not exactly.
So how did they pull it off?
They got creative, to say the least. They managed to secure a last-minute ride for their precious cargo on a C-17 military transport plane.
A military plane
Yeah.
for a private rocket company on the brink of bankruptcy. How did they swing that?
It's a bit of a mystery. Even Berger doesn't go into the specifics, but I suspect it involved some high-level phone calls, a bit of arm twisting, and maybe a healthy dose of luck.
Sounds about right. So they've got their ride, they load up the Falcon 1, RatSat and all, and they send it off on its merry way to Kwajalein.
Yeah, merry way might be a bit of an overstatement.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, the flight to Kwajalein, it didn't exactly go smoothly.
You're kidding. What happened now? Don't tell me. They hit some turbulence and the rocket rolled around in the cargo hold.
Worse.
During the flight, the Falcon 1's first stage fuel tank, which was pressurized, partially imploded.
Imploded, as in caved in on itself, while it was thousands of feet in the air.
Exactly.
Oh my God, how does that even happen? What caused it?
It seems like a miscalculation during the pressurization process.
Right.
Basically, they didn't account for the change in air pressure at high altitude.
Oh no, so they're on this military plane with a rapidly depressurizing rocket. This sounds like something out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it?
What do they do?
It was a tense situation, but they managed to think on their feet.
Thank goodness for small miracles and quick-thinking engineers.
They manually vented air into the tank to repressurize it, and somehow they managed to land safely.
Safely, but I'm guessing with a slightly dented rocket.
You could say that again. Oh man, those poor souls. Talk about adding insult to injury. They must have just wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear after that.
I'm sure they did.
So they land, dented rocket in tow. What happens next?
Well, now they had a new problem to deal with. They had a damaged rocket, a rapidly closing launch window, because remember, these things are planned months in advance.
Right, and you can't just launch a rocket whenever you feel like it.
Exactly. There's a lot of factors to consider, weather, orbital mechanics, you name it.
So what were their options?
They could ship the Falcon 1 back to California for repairs.
Which would have taken, what, weeks, months?
At least, and would have cost a fortune they didn't have.
Yeah, that's not really an option at this point.
Exactly. The other option was to try to fix it there on the island.
Which, let me guess, wasn't exactly easy either.
Not exactly. I mean, they had limited resources, limited time, and they were, on a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It did to a lot of people.
So what did they do? Because knowing SpaceX, I think I can get.
They went for it.
Of course they did.
It was a crazy decision, but, that's kind of how they rolled.
So they patched up the Falcon 1 on that tiny island with whatever they can find.
Pretty much. It was an all-hands-on-deck, round-the-clock effort. They replaced damaged components, they reinforced the structure, they basically rebuilt parts of that rocket from scratch.
And they got it ready to launch.
They did, in 7 weeks.
7 weeks. That's insane.
It was incredible, a true testament to the dedication and passion of those early SpaceX employees.
I can't even imagine the pressure they were under.
They were working on a shoestring budget, facing incredible pressure from investors, from the media, from everyone who thought they were crazy for even trying this. But they never gave up.
And finally, the moment of truth arrived.
Yeah.
September 28, 2008, the 4th launch attempt. Did they finally break the curse?
It was a picture-perfect launch.
They did it. They actually did it.
They did. Against all odds, the Falcon 1 lifted off from Omelek Island and soared into orbit.
Oh man, what a moment that must have been. After 3 heartbreaking failures, they finally achieved what so many people thought was impossible.
It was pure elation for the SpaceX team, and I think for anyone who had been following their journey, this wasn't just a victory for a single company, it was a watershed moment for the entire space industry. They had proven that private spaceflight, something that was once relegated to, science fiction and the dreams of billionaires, it was now a tangible reality.
And it couldn't have come at a better time, right? Because they were on their last legs financially.
Absolutely. They were practically running on fumes and prayers at that point.
So this success, it wasn't just about reaching orbit, it was about survival.
Exactly. One more failure, and that would have been the end of SpaceX.
Wow, talk about dodging a bullet.
Seriously. But this success, it did more than just keep the lights on at SpaceX. It catapulted them onto a much bigger stage.
Because this was the moment that really caught NASA's attention, right?
You got it. NASA, they had been watching SpaceX with a mix of curiosity and skepticism.
Can you really blame them?
Not really, but the success of the Falcon 1, it proved that SpaceX was a serious contender.
And that led to NASA awarding SpaceX that game-changing contract, right?
Yeah.
The Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program, or COTS for short.
That's the one. And COTS, it was a lifeline for SpaceX.
Oh, so?
It provided them with much-needed funding, of course, but even more importantly, it gave them credibility.
Because now they had the backing of the biggest name in space exploration.
Exactly. NASA was essentially vouching for SpaceX, telling the world, hey, these guys are legit.
So the Falcon 1, with its, somewhat dramatic journey, it had proven the viability of private spaceflight.
It showed the world what was possible.
And now it was time for SpaceX to scale up.
To go bigger, bolder.
And that's where the Falcon 9 comes in.
Exactly. The Falcon 9, it was a whole new beast.
It wasn't just the slightly bigger Falcon 1, was it?
Oh no, this was a completely different animal. A much larger, much more powerful rocket designed to not just reach orbit, but to revolutionize access to space.
Berger really highlights the sheer difference in scale between the two rockets. I mean, we're talking 1 Merlin engine on the Falcon 1 versus 9 on the Falcon 9. 9 engines. That just seems like, I don't know, overkill. Why so many?
It sounds counterintuitive, but it was all about reliability through redundancy. Musk knew that engine failure was a major risk in rocketry, so he decided to mitigate that risk by having multiple engines.
So if one engine failed, the others could pick up the slack.
Precisely.
That's actually pretty clever.
Yeah.
It's like having a backup generator, but for a rocket.
Exactly. And it worked.
Well, I guess it did, considering they're launching rockets with people on board these days.
Right. But back then, it was a radical idea. No one had ever built a rocket with that many engines before.
It was another one of those SpaceX doing things differently moments.
Exactly. And it paid off.
So the Falcon 9, it wasn't just bigger, it was smarter, incorporating all the lessons they had learned from the Falcon 1, those hard-won lessons.
Absolutely. They took all those failures, all those setbacks, and they turned them into valuable experience.
And this time, they weren't just aiming for orbit. They were aiming to disrupt an entire industry.
The successful maiden launch of the Falcon 9 in 2010, it sent shockwaves through the aerospace world.
Because suddenly, you had this new player on the block offering launch services at a fraction of the cost of its competitors.
SpaceX was shaking things up, and the established players, they didn't know what to do.
Which brings us to that wonderful anecdote Berger shares about Tory Bruno.
Ah, yes, Tory Bruno, the head of United Launch Alliance, or ULA. The Boeing-Lockheed joint venture that had a virtual monopoly on government launches for years.
Right, the big dogs of the space industry.
Exactly. And Bruno, to his credit, he was very candid about the impact SpaceX was having.
I think Berger quoted him as saying something like, SpaceX is kicking our butts on price.
Something like that, yeah.
It's just amazing to think about. This company, SpaceX, which almost went bankrupt after 3 failed launches, they were now the disruptor, the innovator, forcing the giants of the industry to adapt or be left behind.
It's a classic underdog story, and it just goes to show that with enough passion, ingenuity, and a healthy dose of risk-taking, anything is possible.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the early years of SpaceX, what are the key takeaways? What can we learn from their story?
I think there's so many valuable lessons here about innovation, perseverance, and the power of a shared vision. SpaceX reminds us that sometimes the greatest leaps forward come from embracing risk, from learning from failure, and from never losing sight of the ultimate goal.
It's a powerful reminder that even when the odds are stacked against you, even when you're facing setbacks and doubts, with enough grit and determination, you can achieve incredible things. It's been fascinating to revisit these early days, these make-or-break moments that really laid the foundation for everything SpaceX has become.
It's a story that I think will continue to inspire generations to come. A reminder to reach for the stars no matter how audacious the dream.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the early years of SpaceX. From all of us here, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. That way you won't miss any of our updates. Also, if you think this video could help others, please share it with them. Thanks for watching and for your support.